hopefully, Ashley, you're recording. And excellent, I see it. Sweet. All right, so as I was saying, we have a packed agenda. We usually start with the Cloud Foundry Foundation, and I know Swana is here, so she can give us an update on the meeting that's coming, big conference in Philadelphia, right?
Yep. I don't have a whole lot of updates. I mean, I put in everything in the document. I think the registrations are at 808 or something, so they're going really well. Any questions or anything, I put in all the email addresses of the folks that you need to reach out to for any event-related question, or if you have a speaking slot and you have any questions or adjustments that need to be made. For any EU summit-related questions, please hold off. We will have a lot of updates or announcements that we will share at Philadelphia. So all your EU summit questions, just hold off until we're done with Philly. But other than that, I don't have a whole lot of updates. See you all in Philly.
Excellent. But I guess the important thing to also mention is that we now have a contributor day, right? Or half day that Swana is organizing. So if, everybody on this call probably is a contributor, so you should try to join it, right?
Yeah, I see most of the names here on the contributor summit registration. So if you have not updated your registration, you can go back to your registration, modify to add contributor summit onto your registration. It's a $0 add-on. Just please do it. And even if you don't, and if you show up there, we will not say you're not allowed. So, but ideally it will help us with the room setup and everything. So it would help if you sign up right now.
Sweet, thank you.
Yep.
All right, any quick question about Philly summit, other things from anybody? Remember, you're probably on mute. No? All right, so see everybody in Philadelphia. Excellent, thank you, Swana. So I think I know Eric is here for runtime, but Yui also, if you want to jump in at some point. So Eric, maybe you can give us some of the highlights that you added.
Yeah, I'll cover a few quick items, but there's info in the doc too. Few things to note. CLI released a new version a few weeks ago. They now support multi-service registrations, so you can have service instances with the same name with different brokers. CAPI is finishing up a bunch of their work on app revisions, and they're planning to get started with an initial effort on attaching sidecar processes to applications. So there's been a bunch of design discussion around that. There's been a lot of good discussion on the mailing list about this, but Logaritors finally settled on a 6-month deprecation window for the Firehose endpoint, and they're planning on doing some work to help existing projects migrate to the new reverse log proxy and log cache features that are replacing all the old V1 Logator stuff. We'll hear a bunch of exciting stuff about networking later. Thank you, Nitya. But some updates from the networking program. They've completed work on client-side transparent load balancing for internal routes. That also includes things like transparent retries. And they're working now on transparent mutual TLS between app instances on the container network. So people interested in security, I think, are very excited about that. And then I know Garden's continuing to their track of work on better reporting for CPU usage and CPU entitlement expectations. And they're continuing to improve their integration with Containerd as the level above run C inside the Garden container engine. Anyway, so those are a few runtime highlights.
Excellent, thank you, Eric. Any questions from the audience? Anybody? No? Okay, so I guess I don't see the Bosch folks. I see one person from Bosch. Is there somebody from Bosch that can give us kind of a quick highlights?
Yeah, I'm here.
Ah, excellent. Great.
So we released 268.7.0. We've been trying to release more frequently. There's a variety of smaller things in there. Most interestingly are some speed ups to templating and variables, so hopefully deploys are a little faster. We're also starting to experiment with adding in a new lifecycle hook, which is called pre-stop, which should hopefully provide some more information so clustered services can better determine what sort of procedure is going to happen to that instance in VM after the fact. We've also been moving static IPs into cloud configs instead of being statically assigned in deployment manifests, which should help with on-demand services being deployed that need a public IP. And then Monday I sent out an email. We're hoping to remove v1 manifest support and clean up some of the code base. That's about it.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan, for a short and sweet update. But that's excellent. I didn't capture everything, so maybe if anybody else did, let's add it to the agenda. Just a couple more highlights. I don't see any questions for Morgan or Bosch related. No? All right, cool. So let me get to extensions quickly. So one key announcement for extensions is that the app autoscaler project has graduated. So what that means is that now it's not under the Cloud Foundry incubator, but now it will be under Cloud Foundry organization on GitHub. So that's the key thing. But it also is a kind of a testament that of the fact that it's pretty much being adopted not only at IBM but also across the different other folks that have used it and also contributing like SAP, for instance. So if you've never looked at App Autoscaler, I invite you to come to their presentation in Philadelphia. The other key thing to mention is that Stratos has version 2.3.0. There was 2 CVEs, and that's important, that are fixed in there. So if you're using Stratos, you should definitely update to get that. And then also they are adding user-provided service support. And then the other quick highlight is the Blockhead project. They're adding more Hyperledger support. So let me stop there, see if there's any question for extensions. Otherwise, we'll probably go to the talks. Any questions? Okay, cool. Our extensions meeting happens on Mondays, so we'll have new updates next time. Okay, so cool. So the 2 talks that we have are quite exciting. I mean, the YTT tool is going to be first with Nima Kaviani of IBM and Dmitriy. Everybody knows Dmitriy from Critical, and you're probably going to be blown away. So let me stop there and let them, present. So guys, take it. You have 20 minutes, even 25 minutes if you need, because I don't know if Shubha is going to need all of this. And then, of course, let's see if people have questions. So if you want to share your screen.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Hey, DK.
All right. Yeah, I'm a little bit sick, so courtesy of Max and Nima, actually. So might have to break a few times. So I guess, so Nima and I have recently open sourced this project called YTT. It stands for YAML Templating Tool. And I know how you all love YAML, so we thought we'll present this to this group and see if it might be useful to you all. Maybe there's some suggestions, some feedback, and whatnot. So to kind of zoom out for a second, why did we make this tool and what this tool is trying to solve, right? So as you're all aware, maybe what is it now, like a few years ago, 1 year ago, we added ops files to Bosch. And ops files mechanism was meant to allow people to customize and kind of rebase stuff on top of some existing manifests that people ship for Bosch, right? Now the ops files are generic, right? So it doesn't necessarily just have to be Bosch, could be anything, right? But primarily, at least, people have used it to customize their Bosch assets, right? Now, the challenge with that is that, some people, they don't necessarily want to customize. What they want to do is they want to ship some base level configuration and then let other people customize it, right? So there's really actually 2 categories of people that, are involved. What I call those, people are providers, the people who provide this set of manifests. And then there's the other set of people who are the consumers of this manifest and who like to customize things, right? And currently, as you're all probably aware, we use ops files for both of these categories, right? CF deployment producers are the ones that are using ops files to provide some basic functionality. And then there is also whoever consumes CF deployment also adds in their own ops files, like let's say PWS folks, to customize all that stuff. Now, it works okay, if the size is not that large of all of this manifest, not in terms of length of the file, but rather just the number of configurations. But it definitely starts to fail slowly as you get to larger and larger configuration sizes, right? So, CF deployment, again, as an example, it's kind of challenging to support some of those things they're provided. There's potentially some confusion to what users are meant to select for their ops files and whatnot. So the experience, could be better. So this hopefully kind of sets up some of the background here. So the way that some of the other communities out there have solved this kind of a problem is by having two separate tools to deal with this kind of a problem, right? So if you look at Kubernetes community, for example, they have Helm, and Helm uses Go templating to allow the providers to customize, to offer a set of options, right? And then if you look at, people who consume Helm, they ultimately can potentially use, customize, let's say, with a K, to, augment the configuration that it provides, right? So, that kind of works out great, but then you run into this, famous problem of, hey, you shouldn't be templating over text, because really what you want to be templating is over YAML structures, right? And the challenges with templating over text is that you really get into some nasty kind of situations of, trying to figure out how to indent stuff, how to escape stuff, how to do all this kind of a basic YAML things. But there's really a lot of friction to do it because you're not really working with YAML, you're working with text, right? So, if you look at some of these templating agents like Jinga, Go template, and various other ones, you always run into this kind of a problem. So what Nima and I kind of ended up making is this tool that doesn't really deal with text, but rather it deals with YAML structures, right? And when I say YAML structures, I mean it actually deals with, arrays, maps, YAML documents and whatnot, right? So that's the kind of a background for this tool. We wanted to embrace some of the templating, solutions that other, communities have embraced as well. But we wanted our templating to be more usable, have less ways to screw it up accidentally, and hopefully get rid of the unnecessary, crazy escaping things and what other things you have to do, right? So that's where YTT tools comes in. Now, on the front of ops files, ops files provide a syntax, right, that allows you to specify different paths within a document, right? And typically, you probably all seen it, right? There's a type of ops operation, a path for the operation, and maybe an optional value or something like that, right? The challenge with that approach is that a lot of people have to have in their head kind of figure out what is the path to the structure, right? How does it actually look, and translate it into something, right? Translate it into the a JSON path, I guess, format. Now that all works out great, but I think you can argue that there might be a more natural way of kind of doing it. So YTT also tries to solve this problem as well by providing an alternative to ops files, which we call overlays, that allow you to do this ops file like configurations, but they don't require you to kind of translate it to a different format from the format of the document. So that's kind of the background on all of this. I don't know if since we're a fairly small group, if anyone has questions or anything, just feel free to shout out.
Are you gonna show it to us, Dmitriy?
Yes, absolutely. Well, hey, you said you're not into slides anymore, so I have literally 0 slides.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, is this approach similar to like Spiff and Spruce?
Yes and no. So Spiff and Spruce, what they've done before is they use the YAML structure. However, they actually, and maybe that's not necessarily a good word to pick, but they've polluted the YAML structure with their own kind of operational content, right? Now, for example, to give you an example, if you wanted to insert something in the middle of an array, that knowledge that you have to insert something in the middle of an array has to go somewhere, right? So both Spiff and Spruce, they kind of inserted that knowledge into the YAML node directly, right? So YTT offers a slightly different approach. And hopefully it's an approach that people appreciate, but we'll see. All right, any other things?
I think the one thing that I just want to add is that one thing that is important about YTT is that the instructions or the metadata is added as comments in a YAML document. And that makes the entire YAML structure to remain valid throughout, the whole templating process. And that's probably where, YTT is different from Spiff and Spruce.
Right. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. This is a homepage, I guess, for YTT, and it lists a few features and whatnot of this tool. But that's the boring stuff. The more interesting stuff is this interactive playground that shows, what it would look like, to have some input in your, YAML, and then what the YTT tool produces. So to give you a little bit of a walkthrough and to kind of show what we're talking about, what just Nima mentioned about comments and whatnot, right? we have this few examples, and I guess I'll start with let's start with this one over here. We'll start with the most basic one, right? So part of this tool, there is a language. The language is called Starlark. It's a language that's used by Bazel, a tool from Google. Google also maintains the language itself. It's a language that's designed to be very useful to people who deal with a lot of configuration, and useful in the sense that it doesn't have a lot of features, but it has some of the features that make it a pleasant language to use when you're dealing with stuff in templating world, instead of something like a Go template dialect that it's not quite a language. I mean, it's a type of language, but it's not necessarily a friendly to use language. So to kind of jump right in over here, this language is Pythonic. So it has it's not a direct subset, but it's very, very similar to Python. So if you're familiar with Python, should be familiar with this as well. So as you can see over here, we have a key value over here, right, in YAML, and the key is nils. But the value of it isn't specified in YAML directly. It's specified through a comment, right? And as you can see over here, when YTT renders this content, right, it actually knows that none is nil, right? So it's actually translating whatever the language, data structure or data value is into whatever the proper YAML is, right? So to give another example over here, if we change this to 1, 2, 3, right, then it is actually 1, 2, 3, right? Now, if we kind of get deeper into this, right, there's, let's say string, right? And string is, just double quoted thing. But because we're using YAML serialization, right, actually in this example over here, it even shows you, right, if we throw in a pound over there, right, if you weren't just using proper YAML serialization, right, you'll probably have a challenge escaping this, right, because pound would imply that it's a comment, right? However, YTT, again, is working with the YAML structure. It's not really working with text. So it is using this, YAML serialization facilities, so the value gets properly escaped into single quotes. By the way, I think someone maybe commented on something in the chat or something. I can't see the chat, so there you go. Max just pointed a link. All right. So does that make sense so far? So of course you can get fairly complicated things going on over here, like for example maps and arrays of maps and all kinds of other things, right? And all of this is just if you're familiar with Go, at the end of it, eventually just says, you know, YAML on Marshall or YAML Marshall, and it spits out all that stuff, right? One interesting aspect of this tool also, which is somewhat unique to it, since other tools don't really do it, I think, it actually keeps the order of your keys in the same way. So hopefully it makes some of this kind of a, you know, input-output comparison a little bit easier, because all the keys don't jump around. Though I think there might be an option, I forget now. So that's a basic example. So this example kind of demonstrates that we're using power of YAML and power of a you know, proper programming language. So we can get into something fancier, like, for example, defining variables, right? By the way, you all can go to this website. It's all, you know, it's interactive, so you can, you know, play with it. Shouldn't be a problem. So here's an example of a variable, right? A variable is no different from any other, you know, language. You just assign it and good to go. They are mutable, I guess. So it's not, you know, you can reassign it to a new value. It's kind of a judgment call in terms of whether we should allow it or not. So this is not really a functional pure language, right? You know, we'll see what happens with it. All right, so variables are pretty boring. Let's go into an if conditional. So an if conditional gets things going in a more interesting way. So as you can see over here, we have an if that says, you know, if true, I guess it's always going to execute to true, right? And it wraps this key value pair, right? And, you know, if I go in and throw in some more key values pairs over here, like, for example, you know, I don't know, Z over here, right? Then now both of these guys show up, right? And so this is something that kind of gets into the closer to what, you know, some of this other templating languages really provide, right? Is ability for you to have a way to customize this output based on some conditionals, right? That's ultimately where the power of this templating comes in over ops files, right? Is that ops files aren't really that, you know, they don't really allow you to express some more complex ideas, I guess, as a little bit of code. So YTT, given that it works with YAML structure, actually gives you a little bit of sugar around how to deal with YAML. So as you can see over here, you know, in this example, I have if, true, end. So I am closing over multiple elements. But if you do have a one element, since we wanted to get a little bit fancy over here, you can use this special, I guess, keyword if/end. So it only applies to this next node, right? And it's not, again, textual, right? Is if you want to, you know, if you have something like this, right, this continues to work, right? Because the entire node key1b map item is the entire thing, right? And, you know, of course, if you turn it to false, then it will disappear. So that's kind of that. You know, you can nest them. You can use some variables and whatnot. You know, nothing that, you know, nothing should be too surprising here. Same thing kind of happens for for loops. So for loops, you know, you, again, for end, you wrap them. Pythonic way of doing all of these things. You know, you can get fancy with continuous and breaks if you really want to. I mean, we're not necessarily trying to encourage people to get fancy with anything, right? But occasionally you do need a power of a for loop in your template. So that's, you know, that's there for you to use. All right, so then this is where kind of we get into more interesting things. Functions, right? So one of the challenges with kind of dealing with a lot of structure, right, whether it be YAML or whatever, right, is you may want to decide to break it up a little bit, make it more manageable somehow, right? And one way to do so with YTT is to wrap certain structures in functions and maybe even move those functions into different files, right, like little modules and whatnot, right? So an example over here, right, is that we have a function called SumYAML that, you know, has a few map item keys, and, you know, the keys could be as complex as you want. And then we just, you know, say the value of the YAML key is the result of this function. So it just, you know, outputs as one would expect. Now functions are, you know, they can be parameterized, right? So if I throw in over here, you know, variable a, you know, I throw in 1, 2, 3 over here, and for whatever reason I want to use a over here, right? All your parameters are getting passed through and whatnot. And, you know, since this is Pythonic, you can use keyword arguments to maybe be more descriptive. But again, nothing too surprising, but suddenly you can break up some of the larger YAMLs. Maybe, for example, in a Bosch sense, you have a lot of different, jobs inside instance groups and whatnot that you may want to reuse, right? Because you can call a function multiple times and whatnot. And so it gets a little bit interesting. And as I was saying just earlier, you can pull that out into a separate file. So for example, in this example, we moved some of those functions into functions.lib.yaml, and then just calling it. You do have to import them explicitly. We are fairly specific about that. I guess here's a better example here. You're able to kind of reuse them, right? What's also cool kind of about this, right, is these files, right, are entirely kind of a self-contained, right? I mean, I guess if they keep on referencing other files, then it's really a collection of files that's self-contained, right? But this kind of starts tying into an idea of, shipping libraries that may be of use to people, right? So for example, I've been playing with a lot of Kubernetes recently. So I've been kind of toying around with this Kubernetes library. And a Kubernetes library really just provides you with a set of files that provide some functions that will produce you several objects, right? And so, for example, you want to say, hey, I want a basic application, and those set of objects suddenly get turned into, a deployment service, horizontal pod autoscaler and whatnot, right? So you can build up abstractions with this kind of facilities, and it really depends of what kind of abstractions you're looking for, right? So you can make it very useful, or you can make this very annoying, right, to use. I'll pause for a second over here. Any questions so far? Any comments? All right, I'll continue on. So and kind of now that we know about all these conditionals and whatnot, you do want to provide some kind of input from the user potentially, right, to these templates, right, to actually do something useful, right? So for example, in CF deployment, we have lots of ops files that try to signify particular features, right, like enable Windows functionality, or disable etcd or something like that, right? So a lot of that stuff are really booleans, and some of those booleans actually interact with each other, right, in different ways, right? So the idea there is that instead of having this, instead of kind of putting the burden on the user to deal with this kind of a matrix of figuring out what to enable, what to disable kind of thing, you as a provider, if you're using templating, should be able to capture that in a more, natural way for the user, right? So a user, as you can imagine, could be providing over here, let's say Windows true or something like that, right? And, etcd false or something like that, right? And as part of your template, you could actually be accessing those values, right? Now, this annotation, what we call annotations, anything that starts with a pound at, signifies that this chunk of YAML is not part of a template, but rather an input from the user. And you can access that through this data library that we ship as part of YTT. And this data library allows you to access these values directly off of it and actually do something with it, right? So you can stick them in conditionals or do all kinds of things. I guess while I talk about input, one kind of a cool aspect about this, and this is really a benefit of using a fairly well-established project, Starlark from Google, is that you really get to control all of the inputs into this, into this language. And what I mean by that is, for example, currently YTT, and probably in future as well, doesn't have a concept of time, for example, right? There's no way to say like time.now, right? There's also no network access or file system access, right? The only access to files, for example, is through this load facilities that we expose, right? So the entire interpreter is kind of locked down to my fairly paranoid beliefs. So it's a kind of a it's an interesting advantage of this kind of a tool versus, one could imagine, right? Like, why use this tool versus using like a language like Ruby or something like that, right? To write all your configuration files, right? Well, one aspect to it, right, is, when you're running some Ruby code, right, you don't necessarily know what exactly it's doing, right? So it becomes very hard to share some of those things, right? You don't necessarily want to download some random thing of the internet that installs you something and then, you know, steal your credentials or something like that, right? With YTT, for example, given that it's using Starlark and given that it's configuring it to be in very conservative ways, you know, there's no way to, for example, send some data over the network to outside, right? Because there is no network facilities, or there's no way to read the file that the user of YTT didn't allow into this environment. So that's kind of an interesting security aspect of this tool. By the way, Max, how am I doing on time?
You're fine. Probably at some point, like, you could skip some of the simple ones and get to more interesting, like Kubernetes or something.
Yeah. Well, I'm about to jump to. So anyway, so this was data values. You know, an input facility. You know, helps out with actually bringing input from the outside. All right, so kind of jumping into maybe
Obviously,
a more.
Dmitry, a quick question is to say that, I mean, what were you showing the playground, but the tool comes with a CLI that people can actually use and interact with and include in their CI. And you guys have a Concourse CI resource yet? No.
No. But it's a single binary written in Go, so anyone can, you know, download it and use it to their heart's desires. But yeah, very, very good point, right? This is not just an online thing. It's a binary that you just download off of GitHub releases and you use it any way you want to use it. So, you know, now that we know some of these basics of what's provided, you know, there isn't really much beyond that in terms of, you know, what people are doing with templates, right? It's really, you know, like last 2 weeks ago or so, I was, for example, working with Chris Dutra to kind of play around with, like, what would CF deployment look like if one would use something like this, right? Now, obviously, CF deployment is pretty large, right? So that's not something that's going to just happen, even if it ever does happen. But what's interesting, you kind of, you know, once you start dealing with a lot of configuration, you kind of start thinking about some of the abstractions, right? And maybe to give you a little bit of taste of what those abstractions would look like, if you go to, you know, the GitHub organization that holds YTT, there's a thing called Kate's lib. And unfortunately, I don't have a Bosch example of how that would look like. But, you know, one could imagine, right, that you pull up a library that's from this repo, right? And all you say to deploy a Kubernetes application, right, is something like this, where you have, you know, please make me an app that has some name and that has some basic configuration of this particular image and arguments. And then, you know, configure a port. And that's pretty much it. Now, there's some other boilerplate going on over here with this whole template replace, but that's not too interesting. But yeah, the gist of this is that this ultimately produces a chunk of YAML, right, that Kubernetes is actually very happy to deploy and configure all kind of together, right? So that kind of brings some of those things together, right? And as you can see over here, you know, we don't actually allow you to configure much else beyond this 3 or so things. Now, that kind of raises the question, well, if you can only set the name, you can set the image and arguments, and you can set the port, what about all the other garbage that I typically want to set? Maybe like, I don't know, you know, in Kubernetes, there's all kinds of fancy other flags, right, that you're able to set, right? So how do I actually configure all of that stuff, you know, beyond this, right? Now, a most easy approach, right, is that I keep on adding stuff to this library until everyone is happy, right? But that's going to turn very, very bad quickly, right? Because then it will be pretty much exactly all of the configuration that Kubernetes provides, let's say, right? It would have to be here, right? So this goes back to the notion of ops files, right? Is you want to allow your users to customize whatever is given to them, right? But you want them to customize without you having to worry about how they customize it, right? So you want to kind of decouple their customizations from whatever the interface you provide, right? So this is where this feature called overlay comes in. I don't know if I have a full-blown example over here. Yes, I do. But actually, you know what? Let me Let me pop open a different example actually over here. Well, let's see. Is there a good example here? Yes, there's kind of a decent example over here. Overlays actually allow you to do what ops files do, but at a more granular, in a more granular manner, because they understand how to deal with documents or YAML files that contain multiple YAML documents. But they also are a little bit more paranoid in terms of how it's searching the YAML structure and finding whatever it needs to find. So to give a basic example over here, right? So imagine you have this document, right? So it's some kind of object, doesn't really matter what it is. But for whatever reason, you wanna remove this particular, annotation, right? Now in ops file world, right, of course you'll have to figure out, okay, well, the path for this is gonna be metadata, annotations, and then this thing over here, right? And as people familiar with ops files, they also know that, because there's a slash in the value, you have to escape it in a particular way in this path. So it doesn't get, it's not that pretty, or as pretty as one could hope. However, in this new way of doing it, overlays, what you do is you define a different file, a different YAML. I mean, or I guess you can just technically stick it in there as well. That has a few annotations attached to the objects. So I think this is the first time I'm actually showing you guys an annotation attached to the document object, right? So what this says, right, is that it says, find me a document that contains metadata, name, example, ingress 1 content, right? So there's different ways how to match things. And one of the built-in kind of a selectors is a way to just say, does some other object contain this mini object or subset, right? And so, in our example over here, it will find this object. It won't find this object, right? Because the name is different. And ultimately then all you have to do is you just dump the same structure, right? Metadata annotations, let's say this thing, right? And then you again annotate what you actually want to do with this particular thing, right? So in this particular case, we're saying we want to remove this annotation, right? And by default, map items get mapped or get matched by their name, right? So of course they'll find this guy and I will remove it. So that's actually going to be the outcome of this, right? Now, maybe a more fully featured example here is, let's find the ingress 2 and insert some things, right? So here we're saying it's okay to insert these 2 new things. And some of the, I guess, facilities over here is trying to be somewhat protective. So for example, if I remove this annotation over here, oh, actually that's not the example I'm sure. If I remove this over here, nope, that's not the one. What did I want to show? Right. So I guess it won't be actually easily shown here in this example. But the idea here is that we actually have to explicitly say that this item is missing, and it's missing in the original document, right? To avoid accidentally overriding kind of certain things, right? So the idea behind this is just like how ops files are by default, they expect the keys to be in the documents, right? And sometimes you have to put in some question marks. Overlays are quite similar in that, but they go a little bit even further and are fairly explicit about some of the content that you're inserting. Now, some of those features you can turn off and turn on, so to customize it kind of, right? But the gist of it is that it tries to help you avoid accidentally making typos and all kinds of other things, or maybe, accidentally inserting things in the wrong places. So that's kind of the gist of overlays, right? So we kind of went from the templating world into this world over here. Now, overlays could be used by the people who are writing templates, but they also could be used by the people who are consuming the templates, right? Once they templatized all their stuff, or once they rendered all the templates, right? Yeah, the gist of it is that YTT kind of tries to cover both of these audiences, and we think that providing templating facilities is better for providers, and then providing overlay facilities is better for people who actually customize the configuration. So Max is saying that I have a little bit of time left. Does anyone have any questions? Any discussion topics or anything like that?
So I don't know if there's anything on the chat. We probably need to go to the next talk. I think let me say to everybody, I mean, I think personally that this has a chance to revolutionize the way you do YAML. Dmitriy is not gonna say that, but I know he's thinking that. And Nima, this is awesome. I think you all should try it, because basically now you can actually write real programming language and you can annotate, and it just changes things. There's so many directions on this. So I don't know. Is there a final word that you want to say, Dmitriy or Nima, to tell people what to expect?
Well, thank you for listening, and feel free to find us on Foundry Slack or email or GitHub, and we're happy to discuss anything.
Yeah, and look for more actually. I'm trying to keep up with these guys. You'll see a lot more coming up. Anyway, all right. So feel free to reach out to them. So the next talk, I guess, Shubha from Pivotal also, and she's gonna talk to us about how Foundry and Istio are integrating. They have really cool stuff to show us. So maybe Shubha, you can take it from there.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
You just have to share a screen. There we go. All right, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have a couple of people from the networking team here, and we have Nitya, who's the engineer, and also Claire, who's joining us as product manager. So I'll actually hand it over to Nitya. She'll do the demo. I'm not going to talk much. Yeah, but I'll be around to answer questions.
All right, sweet.
Hello.
We don't see your screen. Perfect. Yeah, there we go. We see you.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to demo weighted routing, which is one of the first features of Istio integrated with Cloud Foundry. The Istio networking tier is deployed side by side with what already exists. So when you include Istio in your deployment, it adds an Istio domain to your CF domains. And if you push apps to the Istio domains, then you can leverage Istio features like weighted routing. So the use case for weighted routing specifically is like A/B testing or canary releases or gradual rollouts. So you can have like a specific amount of traffic to each version of your app. So yeah, cool. I'm going to share my screen. Okay.
Yeah, we see it. And I guess people can pinch to see it bigger, I guess.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, so the starting state here is that I have Dora version 1 deployed with a route, and Dora version 2 doesn't have a route yet. So if I forever curl this route, oh no, you'll always see it hitting version 1. Cool. And if we look at the route mappings, you can see that every every route has a weight now associated with it. So the weight by default is going to be 1. So the weight for the one route that we have is 1 right now. So we want to roll out version 2 of this app. It'll also get a weight of 1, which is the default, which would mean 50% of the traffic would go to version 1 and 50% would go to version 2. Let's say we don't want that. So we want to make more of our traffic go to version 1 because we're not confident. Okay, so we can do that by doing CF update route weight for Dora version 1 and making the weight 9. This is just a CF CLI plugin. Cool. So let's check that it got that value. Cool. So the weight has been updated to 9. All right. So now let's set up a route for version 2. And as we just talked about, the default weight will be 1. So the weight for version 1 is 9. The weight for version 2 is 1. So that means 90% of traffic should go to version 1 and 10% of traffic should go to version 2. So we can see that again in route mappings. One of the routes has weight 1, and the other one has weight 9. It'll actually take a sec for this to start working because it's hitting a CAPI endpoint, and then for the Istio components like Copilot and Pilot to sync it up with the router, that polling interval is every 30 seconds. So we should soon start to see that 10% of the traffic goes to version 2. Yeah, so mostly ones with a couple of version 2s sprinkled in there, if you can see. Oh, there's like one up here. Yeah. Okay. And then if you want to now switch over most of the traffic to version 1, or to version 2, you can update version 1 to have a weight of 25, update version 2 to have a weight of 75, and then now we should see most of the requests go to version 2. Soon, in like 30 seconds. Okay, so now like about 3/4 of the requests are going to version 2 and 1/4 to version 1. All right, that's all I got. Does anyone have any questions about this stuff?
I guess an obvious question is if you put weight value that doesn't add up to 100, it fails, or it tries to round it up?
Yeah, so we are only supporting numeric weights. So the weight has to be between 1 and 128. And we are supporting, the way it calculates is there's a numerator and the denominator. So your weights could add up to more than 100. But yeah, if you have more than 100 apps that are mapped to the same route, we probably, I don't think that's going to work because we don't support fractional weights. In fact, Istio doesn't support fractional weights right now.
But also, the weight value have to add up to 100 too, right? So you
No, they don't have to add up to, because it's a numerator and denominator, right? So it can be anywhere between 1 and 128, and it's basically like whatever. Let's say app 1 has a weight of 1, app 2 has a weight of 1. We do a 1 upon 1 plus 1, right? So it's a 1 upon 2 and 1 upon 2. So it doesn't have to add up to 100 actually.
I think some people call that proportional.
Yeah.
Right. I guess, I mean, it's I'm sure it's plenty, I should say, for everybody. But, we've heard that before. Anyway. Very cool, though. And this comes in CF, the latest version of CF deployment, right?
Yeah, it's actually been around in the versions of CF deployment for a while, and we have an Istio release. We have instructions on how you can install the Istio release. Only the CF CLI plugin is new, but otherwise it's been there for a while in the Istio release, and we have instructions on how you can set it up on CF Dev. Also, I should mention that we do hope to actually support percentage weights, but given that there are some CAPI limitations, we just chose to do numeric weights first.
So this might be a little bit off topic, but with this feature, does that mean that a recommended approach to doing production-like deploys in CF is to use this feature versus, I think there is another feature called blue-green deploys, right?
Right. So I think the feedback we've heard in general is that blue-green deploys are too basic, and most customers find it like doesn't meet their needs because it's really like, okay, you create another app, you map it, and then you switch over at some point. But um, this is not production ready yet. It's still experimental. So we don't think this will be the recommended approach to switch over apps right away until we are able to get it to a place where it is part of mainstream. It's out of data. Um, yeah. So as Nitya mentioned in her demo, like we are right now recommending it as a parallel routing control plane. So you have another domain which is mapped to the Istio router, and only apps that are mapped to that domain actually can use weighted routing. So it's not. So we went with that approach so that we can at least start like pushing out features and have customers use it and start getting feedback. And we are taking the approach of releasing some of these features which are not currently supported in the current routing control plane, like weighted routing. And we are also now working on app to app MTLS and new features for container networking which don't exist in the current container networking layers. And our hope is that we'll be able to, this is sort of like we are exposing these new features so customers can use them and give us feedback, and it'll hopefully create some amount of interest in this new routing tier. Otherwise, if we had just worked towards parity, it might have been very tough for us to convince people to actually use it at all.
Just to clarify, I guess the Istio portion plus the Envoy portion, this also applies to the app-to-app communication, right? The weighted routing?
Not yet. Yeah. We haven't tested it, actually. It might just work. I haven't tested it. I think it might just work. We are focused on like client-side load balancing, retries and timeouts, and MTLS for app-to-app communication first. And I think weighted routing should work. We haven't tried it. I can try it and tell you.
I've tried it. It does work, but we don't make any promises.
Sounds like that was a promise that it's going to work.
Try it, Dmitry. Any other questions? I think I see somebody on the chat. Let's see. What are some of the challenges to making this production ready? This is Tyler.
So
you should talk, Tyler, next time.
yeah, Tyler's sitting right next to me. But scale is one of the issues, right? So we've tested external routes to 20,000 routes and 20,000 apps, but we haven't tested it to like 250,000 yet. The other issue I can see is just parity, right? Like we cannot make this production ready until it's maybe at parity with the Go router. But that's something maybe we should, that's an assumption we should check. But I think scale is definitely one of those issues.
Cool, thank you. Any other quick questions? I mean, we're doing good on time. We have 5 minutes left, but I guess maybe one thing, Shubha, is can you talk about like your roadmap in terms of what's coming next in terms of your leveraging of Istio and what people should expect besides getting it production?
Yeah, so I think one of the next things which should come pretty soon is support for dynamically configured sidecars, supporting like client-side load balancing, retries and timeouts for app-to-app communication, and transparent MTLS for app-to-app communication. And then we'd be focused on MTLS from the edge envoy to the sidecar envoys. And I think we will work on scale in parallel. And then I think once we have those things, we are still trying to figure out our roadmap, but I think we will start working on a lot of the Go router parity features, right? We need to get to parity at some point to be able to deprecate the Go router and actually start using this. And that's still a very long timeline because we'll have to give the community a long enough transition window, but we have to start working on parity from the Go router to this. So things like isolation segments, route services, sticky sessions, supporting multiple domains, custom context paths. We don't do any of that right now in this, right? So there's a long list of Go router parity features that we need to get to. And I view scale as also being one of them, because the Go router today has been proven at scale and is being used at scale. So I think there'll be a long list of parity features that we'll have to work on before we can deprecate the Go router and the TCP router.
Cool. Let's see if there's any questions. Anybody? No? All right, I'll keep asking then. I know pivotal product managers never answer the question of when, but you listed a lot of really cool stuff. I mean, let me ask you at least this. This is for this year, right? Like 2019?
I cannot promise parity with the Go router in 2019. So I think when I started on the routing team about a year and a half ago, one of the questions we asked was what does it mean to have parity with the Go router? What are all the things the Go router supports, right? Because the Go router actually has been in existence for 6.5 years or something, and it came to us from VMware. So we actually went in and dug in a long list of things that the Go router supports, which I don't think is an exhaustive list of everything the Go router supports. So I cannot promise parity by the end of this year. So yeah, I don't have a timeline. I think it's a longish timeline.
But people should try it, right? And at least, get familiar with it, and hopefully they are comfortable to start using it.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that is our intent with trying to release this in an incremental way, right? We didn't want to wait all the way till we have parity, till we even have a few features out, and we will keep releasing features incrementally on this routing control plane, and we are hoping that eventually it'll reach a place where some customers can actually use it enough.
Sounds like June, July, something like that.
Hey man, you're not a PM anymore. That's why you're giving dates.
Yep.
Anyway,
Dimitri, we welcome you to work with us.
Yeah.
I can help with figuring out the dates.
Cool. Okay, well, this was very exciting. I mean, obviously, if you're interested in Istio, check it out. I give everybody back, I think, 2 minutes of their time, since I don't see any questions. Last chance. Nope. All right. I'll see everybody in. Oh, there is a chat. Hold on. Let's see. I guess we talked about this, the feature stated for 2019 already, so that covered it. But I will see everybody in Philadelphia. Come to Philadelphia. They're great cheese steaks, I think. Something like that. Cheers. Bye.